um, you don't need to have one jurisdiction or one set of rules that is based on territory. In Prospera, the regulation is based on your specific business, right? So you can say, okay, I'm a business here, I have a medical clinic, and then you have choice. So I choose that the regulations from Norway apply to me or from Japan. The same is like for a real estate company. So you can pick and choose among a menu of options, right? This country that is credible has regulations. These have been used for X amount of time.
Welcome to Bits and Borders, a podcast by Activo Media exploring frontier technology and frontier markets. I'm your host, Aaron Stanley, and today I speak with Niklas Anzinger, who is the CEO of Infinita. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Niklas. All right, so I'm here with Niklas Anzinger, who's the co-founder and CEO of Infinita City. Niklas, it's great to have you here.
Fantastic to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So, Niklas, I'm super excited to talk to you today about what you're building at Infinita and Prospera. And this is probably one of the most ambitious experiments happening anywhere in the world right now when it comes to science, technology, innovation in general. So, to start things off, I was hoping you could just give us a quick TLDR on both Infinita and Prospera. Like, what are these entities and what's the inspiration behind them?
Yeah, sure. So obviously there's a lot going on. I would broadly characterize this as in the industry of governance, right? So governance, if you see it as an industry, like roughly defined by the amount of money that governments spend, is the largest industry in the world. It's like at least 30% of world GDP. And it's an industry that's characterized mostly by local monopolies and cartels, right? So there is a very low amount of competition between them, but there is competition, right? So there are places like Caribbean islands, like Estonia, or like golden visas, Dubai, and Portugal, Malta. So several countries with programs. So there's always a competition for people, especially wealthy people. So they are the ones who kind of already have access to a lot of options. So the idea is, why can't we like do a startup, right? So to make this more accessible to more people, even if they're not like yet super millionaires, right? So this is broadly the industry we're in. Like, can we build new jurisdictions, new kind of contained units where there is an authority that competes with other authorities for citizens, for people, for consumers, ultimately you. And because you have choice, these entities are then they're then in the position that they need to give a really good service. So you come to them and you're not going to the next jurisdiction. So you could define that as competitive governance. Where the idea is, if we make a lot of startups like Prospera, like Infinita, then the world would be a much better place. And we'd have much better governance services and much less abuse by governments of their people, because they have options, they can just leave. So in that industry, Prospera is in many ways really a new flagship or a beacon of hope, right? So Prospera is in Honduras. It has a special economic zone status under Honduran law and under the Honduran constitution. And this special economic zone allows it or gives it very far-reaching legal autonomy to provide their own governance services, which include, for example, tax and labor law and business registration, generally business laws. But it's limited, right? So it's not, Prospera is not able to give citizenship, for example, doesn't have like its own army or national defense, and that needs to abide by the Honduran criminal code, for example. Now, Prospera has this special status, and any land that it buys voluntarily in a voluntary transaction, that can be under its jurisdiction, sort of with a public entity on the Honduran side that it's granted this authority by. And Prospera has a really beautiful spot in an island called Roatan, which is very safe, has good infrastructure, and is just a very attractive and gorgeous place in many ways. All right, there's actually two other projects in Honduras and on the mainland that are also very interesting to talk about, but Prospera is kind of the one that, especially in tech circles, is the one that's most exciting. Now, I landed here in Prospera about 3 years ago, and I had no idea something like that would be possible, even though my mind has been going in that direction, right? I was kind of frustrated by how governments handled the pandemic and how slow, especially progress in medical is, right? Even though we have science and technology that just is far ahead of what we see right now. That is because really of government or institutional lag of things as being too slow and too expensive. So Prospera really for me was like, wow, something like that is possible. This is like a 0 to 1 moment. That's why I'm here and building a business with Infinita, right? So Infinita City is a separate business from Prospera. It's within Prospera. And I'm doing it because I think if we make Prospera succeed, then that can be the basis for hundreds of other Prosperas in the rest of the world. So as an example, that something like this is possible. And with Infinita City, we often say we're building, if Prospera is building a city, Infinita is building a district focused on biotech and biomedical, right? We are sometimes in crypto language say that Prospera is a layer 2. They provide sort of the basis, governance, and legal system. And then Infinita is a layer 2, right? So the layer 2 brings people. It reduces basically the transaction costs for people and apps to build on top of the layer 1. So there we are now with Infinita City, right? So we have like a community of like 30 or 40 permanent residents here and several thousands that are in other places that are affiliated with us or have been here or have a business here or are working together on the same mission. So Infinita is a permanent community here in Prospera. So anytime if you want to visit Prospera, we're organizing events mostly on crypto and on bio. Right, so if you want to kind of check it out or become part of it, you'd find kind of some events that you can go to, and then you can see what this is all about.
So it's really interesting that there are a number of really big name tech investor and founder types who have supported this experiment in some capacity. So, I mean, names like Brian Armstrong of Coinbase, Balaji Srinivasan, Mark Andreessen, even like Brian Johnson, the longevity guy, right? Like, why is it that all these guys are all so excited about, I guess, what some might dismiss as just some kind of crazy governance experiment in the Caribbean?
Sure. To be precise, by the way, a lot of people in headlines always say, oh, Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen, and Sam Altman. These three are not that involved or aren't involved at all. It's just my awareness, right? So they have invested in a fund, in Patrick Friedman's Pronamos fund, that has invested in Prospera, but it's, compared to other investors, a quite low amount. But people always use that as a look at all these billionaires or whatever. So now it's true that Brian Armstrong has significantly invested in Prospera, has visited. Balaji Srinivasan, Naval Ravikant has been here, recently also Tim Draper. But mind you, this all started last year. So this is like less than 15 months. While we have been getting this headline of all these like crypto billionaires or whatever, we didn't want that to be like, we wanted that to be the case, but this wasn't the case up until like that just recently happened, right? So just as a note, right? Through that time, especially with the Honduran government stuff going on, we're entrepreneurs here who are doing like very grinding and hard work. It was super difficult to raise funds because of the political situation. So it's not at all the case that this is like an enclave for billionaires or people who made it. Like everyone on the Prospera team, every resident here, everyone who lives here, like we're entrepreneurs who are grinding and to building something great. We haven't like yet made it, or don't have that kind of fame that some of these people to whose attention this is coming now already have, right? But now they're coming, which to me feels very rewarding because again, we've been working very hard for a long time to bring it to the attention of people like that. And Balaji Srinivasan is a good example. He's been a thought leader in that space, the network state. So this is kind of an idea whose time has come, I think, and we're fair and square kind of in that industry. I'm going to take great inspiration from that. Brian Armstrong with Coinbase realizing that crypto is ultimately a means to an end to power the real world, right? So that it is to transact and value, but then what is the value and how do we shape it? How can it shape the real world? So our idea of crypto cities, for example, really comes directly from a fireside chat that I had with Brian Armstrong, where we discussed that sort of the real world building cities is kind of the final frontiers from crypto. That's what it's all about. Sort of having like the real world asset piece, the property rights that are on chain. This is ultimately what crypto is all about. This is why someone like Brian Armstrong, who has this bigger vision, kind of saw that vision reflected in what we're doing here in Prospera. But again, this is part of supports that we've just recently gotten. We're inviting more of course, but we're still like we're a place that still wants to grow and is aiming to attract a lot more people.
Yeah, it's super interesting, especially the Brian Armstrong piece. Because I think I'd seen some headlines about this back in, I think it was maybe January of this year when Coinbase Ventures made it. I think it was undisclosed size, but it was just disclosed that they had invested in Prospera, and I saw Brian Armstrong was there physically, and I think there definitely seems to be the year when people in crypto are, uh, I guess the way to paraphrase what you just said there, like people realizing that, okay, crypto is not necessarily just the end in itself. Like crypto is a means to an end. Like what is the end? Like what is it that we're actually trying to achieve here? What's the value we're trying to unlock? And I think these types of experiments are really interesting kind of manifestation of that. So it's like, hey, if we have all these crypto kind of rails and tokenization, the ability to move property around and have different types of rights embedded in code and this type of things, like what does that actually enable? So that's super interesting, and I mean, I think it's just really, it's obviously a huge endorsement if the CEO of Coinbase is coming and showing up and saying, "Hey, I like what you guys are doing here." That's, I mean, a lot of people wish they would have that, wish they were in that position. So, so congrats on that. That's a really great milestone. It must be pretty rewarding for you guys and validating too. It's like, okay, we must be hovering over the target here if all these other guys are interested in this. Um, just how did you personally just become interested in this kind of this world of startup cities, new governance models? Maybe talk a bit about like what was your journey into this whole thing, and then like what is your role currently? Like how do you spend most of your time as CEO of Infinita?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's always a very circuitous path that made me end up here. But for some reason, I've kind of foresaw it, right? So I have this like high school yearbook where you're supposed to describe where you'll be or what you'll do in like 20 years. And I did have, in fact, in there that I'm building this utopian city project. Right. I did have it in my high school yearbook, like, which is kind of crazy in hindsight because, for the longest part of that time up until now, I wasn't thinking I would actually do that or it's a realistic possibility. Right. So, of course, I have where my mind goes is, and I was very inspired by science fiction, very early times. So that I think that's something that most people in tech or in these kind of sort of techno-optimist circles have in common, right? So we think about the world and how it could be different. So we think of, space exploration, of like building cities in the cloud or underwater, and to make ourselves cyborgs and all of that. So that is pretty much where these kind of ideas, where my mind was going from a very early age. Where what I chose as my sort of career path, I thought I need to go into policy, where I thought the biggest levers to change things were to achieve some of these big things, which wasn't entirely untrue, or is entirely true. But at the same time, I went into research. I studied philosophy and economics and public policy. I went into Washington, D.C. think tanks, so into management consulting for the public sector. But I was kind of disappointed, right? So this is not something where this kind of change happens. When the kinds of changes that we really need aren't really happening, or like impossible to make happen. Like all these like legislative or reform changes or whatever, you have to work for like 20 years on a narrow thing to have like a small chance. And even that happens very rarely. And if it happens, it's usually superseded by like more bad policies coming and kind of superseding it. So, right, the whole thing with like, okay, we're cutting government spending, deregulation under Carter and all of that. Okay, great. But very soon after, there's lots of other things coming. The FDA and medical has been deregulating a few times. And, sometimes and often those were also good ideas, and temporarily like the spending declines or the cost to get like a drug approved. But then it immediately shut up again, right? So there is really absolutely no reliable method we found to kind of stop this whole continuous expansion and overreach of government, which just happens really gradually all the time. So I didn't know what to make of things then, and I wasn't thinking about the kind of things I do now. So I went into technology and entrepreneurship, right? So Berlin, where I was at the time deciding to start my career, had a good startup scene, and I had the fortune to join a very strong, fast-growing startup at the time, as a very early employee, and I carried it on a growth path to Series B, and kind of felt over 5 years I learned like all the tools of what I need like to build a company and realize my own vision. So about 5 years ago, I reached a point where I said, okay, now I need to go out and find this big mission or vision that I want to realize as a founder. And around the time, it was just when COVID started, and I got into like health, into especially healthcare data analytics, because the company I did before was in analytics and B2B. So I was thinking, okay, what needs to be done here? And I found no lack of problem at all. Like healthcare is a big mess and entirely lacking, or like very thoroughly lacking in technology solutions. But then I kind of realized, like, look, even if we really improve the data pipeline to like really great new solutions, like biologics or small molecules, drugs or treatments, the limiting factor is not in the technology or science. The limiting factor is in the go-to-market, in the commercial path, which is blocked really not only by the FDA, but really by a plethora of different other sort of agencies and institutions that prevent or make healthcare kind of a very captured market. And since I learned economics, I was always totally attracted to the idea of free markets, sort of, the Milton Friedman Chicago school kind. And that was kind of what I was looking for. Hey, is something like this possible? And that's ultimately, where I ended up. Okay, it's not possible through reform, right? So what about all these like seasteading things? Okay, that sounds kind of utopian. But then when I came to Prosper for the first time, like 3 years ago, I was like, wow, this is it. This is actually possible. Back then it didn't have like a lot of attention. Like it just like had the Scott Alexander article came out of them, but there was almost no external person living there sort of before my wife and I came, right? They had a team that built stuff, and it was very impressive. Like I already realized, like, guys, you've come really far. How come nobody knows about this? So that's kind of when I made it my mission first to start Infinita VC, the VC fund, which brought a bunch of startups. And then we kind of realized we need to do something bigger here, which is where Infinita City was born, right? So Infinita City, again, sort of a business within Prospera. We're building a community, bringing mostly startup founders in biotech and in crypto. And, my day-to-day here is I'm in the Duna Tower, this 14-story tower. And the co-working space is like 2 floors down. Several of my team members are here. So we constantly have visitors. We constantly run events here. With the company, we're building some crypto solutions on the ground. So and everyone else in the community, almost all of us are like startup founders. So we're like, we're working on our stuff. We're helping each other, give each other feedback. And occasionally, like we have like a football group that we do together, Pilates or scuba diving or something like that. So it's a real community here.
That's super interesting. And it's interesting. Like you were exploring this whole idea for like intellectually for a long time. Then you finally showed up to Prospera. You're like, wow, this might actually work. Right. Mm-hmm. Everything else you'd been working on up until that point was you're kind of hitting dead ends. Like
exactly. Okay, this is like this is Paul Graham essay that I read before all of this, but it only kind of made sense in hindsight. Like there's all these like startup wisdom in Paul Graham essays that you don't realize before you're at that point when you build a startup, right? And that essay was the bus ticket theory of genius. And the question was, where do you do the best work of your life? And he said, it's not in kind of, what you're passionate about or what you're good at. These are all approximations. But he gave the example of collecting bus tickets, like something you kind of have some singular irrational obsession with, like something that seems like weird and boring for almost everyone else. But for some reason, like you're super drawn to it. And to me, those were these kinds of policy, regulatory questions to the deep end of like philosophy, right? So I became just so fascinated with how it's like these very boring like stuff written on paper that is influencing everything else. So kind of in hindsight, I was kind of like, okay. And all the time before that, and I was like building another software business that had nothing to do with it. I was spending all my time like reading books like on economics or philosophy that were getting me in that direction. And I always thought, okay, why am I even doing that? Like I should work on my business and do something like rational, reasonable. But then in hindsight, it all made sense. Like most of the people that I've been on my podcast since, like the Stranded Technology podcast, I've read their stuff before. So I was like prepared for all of these conversations. It's like, for some reason, my mind, my curiosity was going to this place and eventually found it.
Well, and it's super interesting that you've had this kind of this dilemma between like you want to enact some kind of reform, you want to enact some kind of positive change. Is the best way to enact that change by working within the system or trying to just build something new outside of the system, build some sort of alternative. And this is kind of one of these like endless debates, like back and forth, I suppose, that you could have for days, for years. And I think, and me personally, like one of the reasons that I was perhaps like, I found libertarianism, I flirted with libertarianism kind of strongly in college, and I found it kind of repulsive because for a couple of reasons. But like the main reason was I just thought these people were just kind of crazy. Like this stuff isn't actually going to work in real life. Like there's no way you can actually adopt these things. And then I spent most like 10 years of my career in Washington, D.C. We probably actually overlapped in Washington, D.C. for a period. I was there from like 2010 to 2020. And then you realize that like trying to work inside the system doesn't really I think we're even seeing that with Elon Musk now and the whole Doge system where, he's like, the guy's just taking a chainsaw at everything. But like, what would they've saved like $100-200 billion, which is just, a fraction, infinitesimally tiny fraction of the US budget. Like there's no turning that ship around. Like it's there's no saving that thing. Right. So I think people are kind of realizing like the limits of the existing, like working within the system paradigm. Right. So I always kind of criticize like the libertarians because like, well, like you're just this weird fringe group that has these weird ideas that can never be implemented. And now it's kind of like, maybe that is the only solution, maybe you just have to find a place to try these things. Right. And, you've seen some of these in places like New Hampshire, right, where there's always this burgeoning kind of class of libertarians. And, but you've never really had a jurisdiction like Prospera, which is kind of like fully built just to like embrace these types of values. Right. Which I find super interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's funny because it was the same for me. So I was also kind of a bit weirded out by libertarians for similar reasons. Also because, it didn't seem like in the real world for many reasons. I did sort of early get that the free market stuff works and is true, and all this like civil liberty stuff is also true. So I kind of saw myself kind of as a proto-libertarian, but like as an organized or political group, I always found that weird. And I probably would still say that to this day. Now I'm a bit on the other side. So my political beliefs have become much more libertarian than before, like extremely libertarian now. Right. But at the same time, when I see organized political libertarians, it's like, what are you doing? Right. So you can't seriously think, okay, you're like the Libertarian Party or whatever, and seriously change things. And then, what I think we're doing now is with Prospera and with Infinita is really building a scalable solution. Like that's what I like so much about it. This is not something that we can only do in one place. Like the idea of like a special economic zone working in partnership with the government, not against the government, but at the same time sort of have this like limited space where you can exit and where you can do something different and compete. This is just something that's been done before. It's been done in China. There's like Hong Kong, there's like Dubai with 33 different special economic zones. So this is just a model that can scale, like that can like deliver what you say you actually care about. But then again, don't see that many of the libertarians there. Like, and I kind of realized most of them are kind of, having their political beliefs also kind of for lifestyle reasons, to be part of a group, and just to criticize for the same reasons what they accuse other political groups of, right? So, I mean, I happen to think that their political beliefs are truer than the others, so that's good. But at the same time, what matters is what you do, not the beliefs that you profess to have, right? So you need to make sure you want to have true beliefs about the world, but what matters is what you act on. Like, what is the dent you want to make in the universe? What's your kind of vector for change?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's kind of the key point, right? Is so if you're operating within the system, you can say like, okay, I have these core beliefs that I hold to be true, but like, is my work inside the system here really bringing about any kind of meaningful change? And if the answer is not really, then it's like, okay, like what am I actually doing here aside from just collecting a paycheck, right? And I think that's where I think if people run into this frustration, and I think it honestly takes a lot of like self-awareness and introspection to even like realize that, right? To realize that like, wow, like there's kind of a dissonance here between what I like profess to believe and what I'm actually doing. And it's one thing if like, you got a family to feed, you got to make an income, whatever. But like, if you're kind of one of these folks who's professing like I'm trying to change the world, but your actions are not lined up with that, what you actually believe, then it's like, okay, gotta look inside yourself a little bit.
And honestly understand that, right? So, most people are at the stage of their life where they wouldn't do that. I was at a stage where, I don't have kids yet, but plan to have them. I was a digital nomad at the time. And so, of course, it was less costly for me to do that kind of change. So this is not something that you necessarily need to feel like bad about. But at the same time, you should just inquire, so what am I willing to do for my beliefs, right? Sort of what am I willing to give up, right? So, and otherwise you just have to realize, okay, like, the convenience of keeping your life as it is overweighs kind of your urgency to act on or make progress on your political beliefs, right? So you just need to be very self-aware, as you said, and be very honest with you about that.
So let's move on and talk a bit about kind of just practically what you guys are working on. And I love this framing that you came up with of stranded technologies, because I feel like that it gives it just a great real visual of the problem you're trying to solve, right? And so the idea is that with these improved governance structures or new governance structures that you're experimenting with in Prospera, we can unlock value that's heretofore been trapped or stranded, right? And I guess maybe like just riff on like what you mean exactly by that, and maybe give us a couple of examples of things. I mean, we've talked a bit about some of the healthcare concepts, but maybe give some examples of like just what are some areas where you see, wow, like there's a lot of just stranded potential here that just needs to be.
Yeah, so stranded technology is kind of a hypothetical. How would the world look like if we didn't have all these like bad regulations and all the sort of government overreach? In the world of technology specifically, right? And sort of the mother of all stranded technologies is nuclear power, right? So nuclear power is sort of very cheap, it's very clean, it's very efficient in so many ways. And when you look into the history, sort of the fear of it and the actual risk was massively overblown, right? Also, the reason that we think now is expensive is because it's of like crazy overregulations. Like you need to have like this terrorism readiness force ready at all times and things like that. So also the things that force it to be big and expensive versus actual light water reactors you can do much more cheaply in a much more smaller scale. So it was really, I think, a moment in history where, and this doesn't always happen, right? So technology often actually finds a way to succeed, despite the political obstacles and despite the fact that people are constantly resisting it or don't want to do it. But at that time, sort of the modern state was strong enough to basically outregulate it, right? It's based on popular, misconceptions and alarmist predictions of what it would do, right? So, and energy is kind of the most limiting factor of almost any industrial progress, right? So any of the progress in the world of atoms is highly dependent on energy. So if we had abundant and cheap and clean energy, this would be, the world as a whole would be an enormous amount wealthier and was able to industrialize faster in poorer nations and give people access to all the technologies that require energy, right? So it's what the entire world runs on, right? We live in the modern industrial age initially because of fossil fuels, which have some unfortunate side effects, and we could have replaced it with something cheap. Now, when you start to see that pattern, right? So there's this like public outcry, and then there's politicians who kind of want to cater to that. Then you kind of see them in many different places, like the 9/11. Okay, the world is full of terrorists and dangerous, and therefore we need all this strict airport security, right? And you see it in the world of biomedical, right? So, something happened to like this person, and there's like this PR disaster. Okay, therefore we need like much stricter regulations and all of that. So you see that in almost any industry, that this is kind of the natural progression of things. But then the problem is nobody takes those things back, right? It's extremely hard to deregulate, right? Because when something is regulated, especially when our regulations often have this like halo effect, right? So it's almost impossible politically to remove like environmental regulation, right? Because people read headlines, they don't read into the actual thing, right? So you can argue all you want that this is actually making the environment worse, but sort of removing environmental regulation just gives your opposition just this blank check of saying how much like of a monster you are that you want sort of to cut back on like environmental protection or something like that. So there's this whole world out there of why we're getting increasingly overregulated in many different areas. But the world could look very different. Like we could have the flying cars. Like we could have drones is one of my favorite examples. Like why are commercial drones not all over the place? Like they're extremely efficient and cheap. It's simply regulation of airspace by the FAA, or like transatlantic speeds. Like so we had the Concorde supersonic and all of that, which was simply there was a speed limit in 1970, which is why airline speed hasn't increased. And we could go like much faster between London and LA if it wasn't for that. So you start to see it. You start to see it everywhere. And then you ask yourself, okay, how did this happen? And how did we get there? And what can we do about that, right? So in many ways, in the areas where we have seen a lot of progress in the world of bits, was also kind of fortunate. Like I was very fascinated to learn that the internet wasn't inevitable, right? It was really a deliberate decision by the Clinton administration to not regulate it strictly. Right? Mm-hmm. Because back then the discussion was the same, or there's like all the scams and all the porn and all the risk of all this bad stuff happening. And I said, okay, we're not going to regulate it, which is also this crazy counterfactual. And you see how much is dependent on these questions.
The regulation of the internet is a great kind of counterfactual there, or the lack of regulation of the internet, whereas it produced this, arguably like, 30 years of, perhaps like the most technological advancement in human history and the most kind of interconnectedness and the most value creation in human history because of that approach, right? Where the original instinct or the initial instinct is often like, oh, there's this new thing, we got to figure out how to regulate it. I mean, you're from Europe. You guys specialize in regulating stuff, right?
We like regulation. Yeah.
So, but then you also just get this. It becomes this kind of whole, bureaucratic industrial complex, right? Where the people that are working in the regulators, like agencies, like they're kind of gunning for their paychecks. Like, oh, if I'm working in the FDA or Food and Drug Administration, I want to go cash out and get a fancy job at some pharma company or some food company or whatever, and what am I going to do? Why would they hire me? It's because I know how to navigate the regulations, right? But if I get rid of the regulations, then like, why would they hire me? Because there's nothing to navigate, right? So there's this weird kind of like the incentives don't really line up, right? The incentives, the incentives line up for like the individuals for making these decisions to kind of keep the existing system in place and use that to their benefit, essentially. And unfortunately, there's a lot of negative externalities to, I guess, entrepreneurs, but also society in general who could be benefiting from these technologies. So let's talk a bit about how Prospera itself specifically kind of solved some of this, or is trying to solve some of this. And first of all, maybe talk a bit about how this is different or maybe similar to like other special economic zones or free trade zones that we see around the world. And then like, I guess just practically speaking, what kind of like legal and regulatory autonomy does Prospera have that entrepreneurs can benefit from?
Yeah, so now we really get into the secret sauce of Prospera, right? So the reason why I chose to be here and stay here, the reason that I think that this is the scalable model that can solve this regulatory problem, right? So there's like so many problems. And the key to answer is a system called regulatory flexibility, as opposed to regulatory monopoly. Right. So the existing idea of regulation is that you have like this one independent agency, like the FDA for this, the SEC for that, the whatever agency for that. They kind of have a defined narrow space where they have a monopoly to make rules. Right. So nobody else makes the rules. So and if you apply the idea or the lens that, we need regulation is good, which I do happen to believe. Right. So regulation has a coordinating function. Like we need rules for everything. Rules make things predictable. Like this is why we have laws. So you need regulations. The question is, how do you get, good regulations and bad regulations? And what's kind of the mechanisms by which you produce good regulations and stop producing bad regulations? That's the key question. Now, when you have a monopoly provider, there's just no choice, right? So there is no strong incentive for others to do something different that sort of defies like the existing norms in a meaningful way, right? So this way things get kind of stuck. Monopolies stop being innovative, and they start being more about like distribution. how like you as a career bureaucrat can get the most out of this organization, but not anymore about how you innovate, right? Because innovation, that's kind of a side theater to like your promotion, and it's like if anything a risk. Like, so we know that from all big companies. How is Prosper solving that? Like, what is regulatory flexibility? So that is the idea that you don't need to have one jurisdiction or one set of rules that is based on territory. In Prosper, the regulation is based on your specific business, right? So you can say, okay, I'm a business here, I have a medical clinic, and then you have choice. So I choose that the regulations from Norway apply to me, or from Japan. The same is like for a real estate company. So you can pick and choose among a menu of options, right? This country that is credible has regulations. These have been used for X amount of time. Now, what serves as like the coordinating mechanisms, which regulations to choose or which are accepted? So that is the idea that you have mandatory liability insurance. So if you're operating a business that has the potential for negative externalities or harm to unconsenting third parties, like in medical or like in wastewater or environmental things or finance, then you need to have mandatory liability insurance. And then the insurer, you can go to the insurer and say, hey, I want to do this. Here's my regulation. Please insure this. And then the insurer has the right incentives. They don't want to under-regulate you because otherwise they have to pay. But they also don't want to over-regulate you, right? Because otherwise you take your business elsewhere, or they have like too high compliance or audit costs. You can just go to the next guy, right? So the insurance, the regulator, is then forced to make a very strong truth-based risk assessment, right? So, and is competing with others, right? So, and if you do something that is a regulation that's kind of well proven and has a long track record, then you get very cheap premiums. But if you want to do something innovative that has not been used yet, then the insurer will give you higher premiums because they need to hire people for risk assessment. So this way you have a market deliver the product of good regulation instead of monopoly, right? So which then produces good regulations at scale, right? So sort of the whole idea that Prosper is like unregulated or anything is like the opposite of the truth. Like the idea is to build the right way, a better way to produce good regulations.
So the idea is basically that, you're not necessarily saying like regulation is bad, regulation is good. It's just more of a question of, you need the flexibility to be able to, each entrepreneur, each sector is going to need can kind of leverage.
Yeah.
Like there's different options for how
you give you an example, right? So, the FDA, much of their regulations are designed for small molecules that are produced at scale, but it's not a strong fit for biologics like gene therapy or cell therapies. They have a different risk profile, right? You don't need to constantly run new trials if you use like the same mechanisms through which you give it into the human body. That's where the risk is coming from. So it's the side of the mechanism, not of like the drug or the therapy and like the final indication. So it's just like these default regulations are just not a strong fit with the real world, right? Whereas this alternative system.
So it's basically like in a traditional framework, right? You'd have the government issues regulations on, drug testing, whatever. And it's usually going to be like a one size fits all kind of thing that everybody has to abide by. Right. When what you're saying is like, we're getting to the point now where, I mean, I think I've seen some statistics lately saying it's like the average clinical drug testing trial in the US now costs like, I don't know, it's like some insanely high number, multiple billion, like tens of billions of dollars for these for the life cycle of these drug tests. And basically what you're arguing is like, well, look, like that might be relevant for certain types of drugs that are like maybe really high risk, but maybe for other types of drugs that are lower risk, like you don't necessarily need to do that within that same like really rigorous, just burdening framework.
Obviously, as a one size fits all, it doesn't fit all of the real world use cases, right? And also, just because you mentioned that and you talked about that, okay, the process is that these like legislators and politicians make these big decisions that affect hundreds of millions of people, which they can't possibly have all the knowledge about that they need because they're typically not industry practitioners. So what do they then do? Well, they go to the industry practitioners. What does it lead to? Lobbying, right? And who has the most like lobbying power? It's the big firms, right? So for whom then it's an opportunity to sort of be ahead of their competition by making the rules in a way that benefits them, but not like the smaller and the more innovative and the more startup-y. So who could possibly have ever thought that this is a good idea that the system is like that, right?
Yeah, and this is where kind of this whole idea of providing governance services in a startup mindset comes into play, right? Where you, when you think of, okay, the small startup taking on the big incumbent in whatever industry you're talking about, right? Like here, you're saying like, we're trying to be the small startup that's taking on the incumbent, which is the government that's issuing these regulations in sort of a monopolistic fashion. And we're trying to basically provide alternatives that are, perhaps just as effective or more effective, but at a much more kind of competitive, cost-effective, like market-based mechanism for offering
Exactly.
these services. Is that
there's a moral argument here, and the moral argument is free to build, right? It's not okay to so business and competition is something very peaceful and very cooperative. Like we all abide, and it's something that I thought that I actually had in Brazil for the first time. Like we kind of have this view of competition as this adversarial process, and in practice, businesses sometimes compete and sometimes cooperate, and they can be cutthroat competitive, like Microsoft against whomever. But what people forget is that compared to like governments or nations or the political arena, businesses accept the ground rules that you can't like physically harm each other and all these kinds of things. All businesses like cooperate on that level that they respect the rules of the game. And very often it's not the rules of the game by governments. Very often it's actually just like common sense rules and rules that have been established by precedent. Like the whole idea that only government can make laws, or like monopolistic governments, is just historically in so many ways inaccurate and flawed, right? So this is just like, we have to recognize how peaceful this idea is, right? You're free to build. And this is also kind of, again, pointing at a model for the future, right? So competition and providing a better service, being free to build and to offer that to customers, is a moral argument. Like this is, you would be coercing someone else, like the people that receive a better service, as well as the business providing it, if you're not allowing this. And it's not something adversarial, it's something peaceful, right? So we're all winning here if you let the process of innovation and of competition unfold.
Yeah, and I think this is a principle that, irrespective of where you are on kind of the libertarian versus socialist, or wherever you fall on this political spectrum, I think this is just something that's can be demonstrated throughout history, right? Or at least throughout the history of
100%. And I'm also saying, like, you don't need to buy or do sort of the libertarian version of like new governance. If you want to do something more socialist, more public provision focused, like that, there's a space for that, right? The whole idea is that we just give hundreds of entrepreneurs the opportunity to try out their system, and then scale what works, don't scale what doesn't work. Like that's the process of startup entrepreneurship is very good at that. Right? So we're very good at figuring out sort of which startups or businesses can scale. Right? There's a whole process for that. Like we're able to build like new $1 trillion and hundreds of $1 billion companies and billions of dollar companies, like on a production line almost, with the process that we have for startups. So why not apply that to the biggest problem in the world?
Yeah, that's a great point. Even kind of taking this back to your point about the unregulation of the internet 30 years ago, right? Like that what that unleashed was this concept of the startup economy, where we didn't really, I think that the concept of a startup didn't really exist before that, right? But obviously, after 30 years of doing this, like it's kind of a science almost of like you incubating startups, accelerating these guys. It's a pipeline, like like, okay, like 9 out of 10 of these things are going to fail, but like the founders will learn something, they'll come back and they'll try to, they'll come back a bit better. And there's a whole kind of learning process that's baked into that. Right. And so this is something that, this is something that like, there's a wealth of knowledge here that I think previous iterations of governments and regulators and people designing these systems, they just didn't have access to these types of tools and technologies. So, I think you could say like, okay, they were acting in good faith. They were doing the best with what they had available at that time in designing these systems. And, we should be thankful to them for doing that. But like, we've reached this point in history where there's just better alternatives now, right? Like you don't
This
need
is
fax
so
machines anymore,
important.
right?
Yeah. It's so important because it's a point that I think we realize in hindsight about history that one of the most influential figures of our time will be Paul Graham, Y Combinator, right? Because they made a playbook, right? So they built a culture and a playbook that anywhere in the world anyone can do, right? So I go to these places like Honduras or like Tanzania, and in all of these places there's a tech scene, right? In this tech scene, they have access to the same tools, the same programming languages, the Paul Graham essays, and as a result, they also teach themselves English, right? So this is just something that's, anywhere in the world, anyone is capable of that now with all the tools that the internet made available. And the one key ingredient that's missing is the governance piece, right? So you do need a place where the rules are done in a way that you can build a business successfully. And unfortunately, that is not the case in most of the parts of the world. Like the United States, for all its flaws, it's still possible, right? Or it has been possible for the last 20, 30 and more years. It's a very business-friendly environment. So once you start experiencing countries like Honduras and African countries, you realize that we still have it very good in the United States comparatively, right? But so we can provide, and if we can provide some of that, and we have a chance to do even better than that, in terms of governance, in terms of being able to register a company, in terms of like rule of law and stability of property rights, in terms of, you can sue someone if somebody wronged you. There's rules for like, mergers and acquisitions and all of that. And there's functioning capital markets. That once we bring that to the world, we really can unleash all this untapped potential.
Kind of piggybacking on that, how do you see what you're building with Prospera and Infinita fitting into this whole like network state movement that was popularized by Balaji? He had a book on it a couple of years ago. But how do you see this fitting into that?
Yeah. I mean, I think the network state is a very good encapsulation of what we're trying to do. I took great inspiration from it. Balaji is a major supporter of Infinita as an investor, and sort of also advising me and speaking at his conferences. So I think it is very much kind of the model that I'm also trying to think about in terms of how I built the company. As if one source of disagreement with it, which is the part about sort of aspiring sovereignty, getting diplomatic recognition, right? So I think that is both practically and philosophically kind of a bit void, right? So for the reasons that I mentioned before, like sounds adversarial to governments, and it kind of is. Like wars has been fought over that, so you don't just need to compete on the same conception of sovereignty. Like what we're thinking about is creating kind of limited spaces of governance and not like this whole thing. Like what does sovereignty mean in the first place? Like it has all this history with like the sovereignty of the king and then the sovereignty of the state. Like what does it mean in practice? When you're a sovereign state, can you do whatever you want to your people? No. There's like norms and international conventions and morality and all of that. Can you screw investors over and take their money? No, there's even like arbitration, international state investor arbitration against that. So that whole idea is just like philosophically a bit void and empty in my opinion anyway. And you don't want to compete with existing nations on that. And instead, sort of what we're building is something, it's not in the slightest way adversarial. It's a win-win situation for most governments and most nations. Like almost any of these governments or nations in the world, they want development into their country. They want investment. They want it, of course, at their terms. But it's kind of, we're slowly sliding them on the realization that, don't try to control everything, right? So, just let these kind of oases of like legal autonomy exist and they'll make you rich, right? So the whole idea of the bourgeois ideal by, who was it? A libertarian author, like leave me alone and I'll make you rich, right? So I think that's kind of the idea I want to promote, and the intention of what I'm doing is not to gain diplomatic recognition of any sort. I think that's like the kind of idea space we want to kind of supersede, right? So but fundamentally we agree on what the vision is, which is just competitive governance and like lots of opt-in jurisdictions that are competing for you and providing a better service in the process.
Yeah, and it's super interesting when you think about it this way, and that like what you're proposing is more than just like, hey, we're just gonna give you a subsidy to come and do something here. But like it's like, no, we're not just gonna throw a pot of money at you. Like we're actually going to give you like a more efficient operating system to like build your entity, right? Which over the long run, that's actually like probably a much more attractive proposition than, hey, here's a big chunk of money if you just come build something in my territory, right?
Yeah.
Because that obviously that pot of money might run out at some point, or there's some strings attached to it, or whatever. There's no free lunch, right, with these things. So, but I find this kind of interesting. In the maybe one more philosophical question here for you, and then I want to kind of close on a couple tangible things, but. I find this concept really interesting. It's this whole network state concept and just this idea of like rethinking sovereignty and rethinking all these things. It's happening at a really interesting time when I think we're watching in real time when the global order is just coming under a lot of stress, and I'm just like Trump tariffs and all these things. But this has all just sort of been happening for a long time. It's not just one specific event, right? It's a multitude of things. And I even saw Ray Dalio publish an article on X last week, basically talking about how he's been talking about like preparing for the new order and all these things. And he posted this article on X saying like basically like the damage has been done. Like we're not going back, guys. Like the international world order is basically breaking down due to bad fundamentals. And whether you like it, whether you don't, whether the tariffs get all reversed and back to normal, like it doesn't matter. Like we're not going back. It's gonna be different moving forward. And if we are to assume that Dalio is indeed like correct here, and he's obviously a pretty smart guy, so it's certainly worth taking his opinion seriously. I mean, what role do you envision concepts like Prospera and Infinita playing in this world as this sort of reshuffling of the global order, essentially?
Yeah. Very good question. I think this is like the providing you with alternatives, right? So if something bad is happening in the world, there's conflicts or even wars between nations, it's really dangerous for you if you're locked into one country, right? So you kind of want to think of your options if that happens. Like you might be in a country where there's like a draft and they might, draft the men into the war, stuff like that. They might increase taxes on you, and all sorts of things. International flights and airlines might be disrupted. These are all things. I'm not a doomer at all. Like I consider all these things with like a lower probability, but at the same time, you just have to realize all that stuff has happened like multiple times within the last like 150 years. So you have to kind of consider that a possibility. So you really want to think a bit, sort of for avoiding some of the negative stuff, but also for getting some of the positive stuff to have options, right? So if you're just like a citizen of your country and have like your bank account there, your business, that's the only passport, and you have residence there, then you're just kind of vulnerable to these kind of disruptions. And there's these things out there like the 5 flag theory, how you can sort of have get more options for yourself and the family, which includes sort of having your residency in another place, which includes getting a second passport or citizenship, which includes having your business in other locations or jurisdictions, which includes having your bank account in another jurisdiction, which includes crypto. I think crypto is one of the ultimate tools for that more, to protect your wealth, right? And to set up sort of to be financially sovereign and not dependent on decisions by big banks or governments and things like that. So I think that's ultimately led for change. Same thing for like the whole idea of network states and startup cities. Like these provide you with more options. So in the world as we live in, sort of the network state is sovereign individual, it already exists. It's nothing new. It happened for the last like several decades, right? And the number one indicator that you can point at to see that's already happening is that the tax rates increased almost the entire world for a very long time. But interestingly, the effective tax rate decreased, right? So governments charge more, but they're collecting less, which is interesting. Why is that? Because rich people leave. Because rich people have options. They can go to Malta and Portugal and Singapore and Dubai. They have all these options, right? They can put their wealth there, their family, they can get a second passport or citizenship. So there's, two conclusions you can draw from that or thoughts you can have. One is everyone should be equal. You should be not allowed to do that. These rich pigs and something like that. Or you say, well, could we have that more of that accessible to more people? And this is, I think, sort of the fundamental thing that I think the network state and startup cities for me are about, right? That's why I'm doing it in a country like Honduras, right? In a country that just doesn't have that much. And also, I'm not rich, right? So I'm realizing through doing a lot of self-education, things like that, I was able to get some of these options. And sort of by having more competition, again, for people and for customers, as citizens, as residents, as builders of companies and of wealth, that will sort of reduce the ceiling to make this kind of optionality, this kind of protection for you and your family and your wealth increasingly more accessible.
And then the idea is that, like, by providing these alternatives, right, or making these alternatives more accessible to regular people, not just super rich elites, the idea is that this will ultimately, sovereign governments, nation states will essentially have to kind of start making reforms to keep these people, right? Presumably, right? They would, if you want people to stick around and pay taxes in your country, you need to make sure that they're getting value out of doing so, right?
Exactly. Otherwise, so I don't think that reform or the idea of reform is a bad idea, right? I just think it gets compounded, and it's just much more likely to be successful if exit is an option. Right. So if exit is an option, then the reformers have a very good argument. Hey, all these people are going to Prospera now. We need to do something to keep those people here. Right. So it gives them and reform can succeed for all these reasons. And the more exit and competition there is, the better the reformers have it. They want to change something like in the United States or in Brazil or in all these other places.
So there's been some criticism and, I guess, headwinds regarding the Prospera project, and we've touched on some of that here. We don't have to go like super deep on this because a lot of this is pretty easily Googleable, and it's kind of complex and probably don't have enough time to really do it justice, but it is like easily Googleable. But it seems to me that like the most common critiques of Prospera and what you guys are building is that it's kind of this like crazy, like libertarian elitist experiment that is just kind of delusional and can't work in real life, right? I think this charter cities idea has been around for a while. Special economic zones been around for a while, but like all these Prospera guys, they're just going a bridge too far, and it's just delusional. And I'm sure you've probably heard that critique a million times by now, but I would like to get your kind of response when you hear that thrown at you.
Well, if it's not going to work out, then what do you have to worry about, right?
That's true.
I mean, it's on us to prove that it works out. It's definitely hard to make it work out, right? And we're in many ways, there's many firsts that we're doing here, right? And, it's not far from guaranteed that it will work out. But at the same time, again, I think we can agree on some of the moral premises, at least, that we should be trying. And if we should be trying, should it look exactly like we do it in Prospera? No. I mean, again, try your version of it. And you can do also some of the things you want in Prospera, even if you disagree with Prospera, right? So the whole idea is not that we agree on like one model. It's that we find the right kind of rules, what happens in disagreement, and how we remain free to build, right? So that's one thing to say. And the other thing to say is, as I mentioned in the beginning, like we're not, big millionaires or billionaires here, right? We're all upstarts, we're entrepreneurs making our way in the galaxy and trying to build something good here. And it's like grinding hard work, and all the shiny stuff and all these like big Silicon Valley and tech elites. That was just, for the most of our history, that's not the case, that they have been backing this from the beginning or have been in any way or meaningfully involved. It's something that changed recently, and I think that's generally a good thing. But we're very humble entrepreneurs that are working hard because we think this is our version of making the world a better place, and this is an invitation for others that might be skeptical to see it for themselves, right? So there is no closed doors. There's no like North Korea guided tour. Like you can go around anywhere and talk to anyone. And I think that has happened several times, that people had like the wrong ideas about us. This is a great YouTube video by Art Chat, for example. So a very negative video about us before he came, and then a much more balanced and a much more positive one after he came. So I'm inviting you to see it for yourself. You don't have to agree with everything, buy into the ideology that we have. But I think it's important to realize or to acknowledge you haven't hurt anyone, and don't plan not to. Like, we're peaceful. We're all trying to just make something, to make something that is making the world a better place.
Super interesting and pretty inspiring, really. I find this stuff super, like, I just love to see folks that are really just putting themselves out there and just at the front edge of the curve here on this type of stuff. And definitely congrats on all the success you've achieved, and kind of wishing you like continued success on that front. And just to maybe, what else do you have in the works at Prospera Infinita over the next like 6-12 months? I know you guys have a big kind of pop-up city happening in June. Maybe feel free to talk about that a bit. What else do you have going on the rest of the year? What are kind of the strategic priorities for you guys?
Yeah, so we regularly do events and theme months here, which are really like co-workations, right? So we're not like entertaining you all the time. We're bringing people here that are working on meaningful things and let them work on their things with a bit of context and a bit of education. And also importantly, opening up our network of investors, right? So many of the ones that we have mentioned on the podcast are regularly investing in startups here, right? So if you're a startup or a builder, this is the right place for you. And we're kind of doing these theme months to make it more accessible. So the next one is happening in June. It's called Crypto Cities. Again, to the conversation I had with Brian Armstrong of, the real world is the final frontier of crypto. So you can come the entire month or a shorter period of time. We do an intro summit on June 5 to 7, and we have a startup demo day on June 28, 29. You can also bring your entire team, right? There's plenty of office space that you can rent. And there is sort of a full stack. Now we also have much cheaper options where you can stay for like, $500 a month in sort of a shared room, right? And like a private room for like 1,000 to 1,200. So these are kind of good entry points to really also see how it is to live here, right? And sort of not just to visit, but you're also free to visit for a short period of time. And then in September, we have a theme month called Biofrontiers. Right, so this is more for the longevity, the biotech, the human enhancement, clinical solutions, and all of that. To all the stuff that we do here on that front. Like we have a lab, we have a makerspace, we have a clinic, so there's plenty of room to play. So just go to infinita.city, and you can very quickly see what your options are there. You can also go to prospera.co. They also have a very good website where they talk about, how it is to visit and what the amenities are there and all of that. So all your questions are answered there if you're considering visiting.
Wow. Well, that sounds really exciting. And looking forward to hearing how all this progresses and seeing, what you guys are able to do over the rest of the year at these events and elsewhere. So Niklas, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and we'll have to do a kind of a follow-up episode here at some point. I still have a lot of questions I didn't get around to asking. We ran out of time here, but
it's kind of
super interesting. This is super interesting stuff, and I think you guys are really at the bleeding edge of all this stuff, and it's worth mentioning that we actually met a couple weeks ago at the Infinita City in Floripa, which is inspired by what you guys are doing. And you were there, and Eric, the CEO of Prospera, was there.
Big fan of the community.
And a lot of this was so there's actually a lot, some of this stuff is actually, these ideas are actually spilling over into Brazil and other places. And so this is definitely something, this is a movement to not sleep on, I guess, if you are an entrepreneur, a founder, a builder of any kind. This is definitely something worth paying attention to. So Niklas, really appreciate your time. I'll include some contact info for you in the notes and everything. So if folks want to find you or get in touch, and then also you mentioned the websites, the Infinita website and also the Prospera website. So folks can go there to learn more. Really appreciate your time today, and wishing you the best of luck in the months to come.